And let's start tonight by talking about Senator Mitch McConnell. He's the leader of the Republican minority in the Senate. And anytime we're talking about Republican filibusters in the Senate, we're talking about him. Mitch McConnell has quietly led all of them. Now, some of the things Mitch McConnell's filibuster has killed: climate change legislation, a public option in health reform, a Disclose Act to force disclosure of who's spending what in our elections, the Employee Free Choice Act, the DREAM Act. Plus, there's the multitude of presidential nominations that have been held up by McConnell's minority in the Senate. Just imagine where we'd be today had McConnell not ruthlessly wielded the filibuster during the first 2 years of the Obama administration and beyond. He has been the single greatest obstructionist in the Senate. He is the filibuster king. Now, as opposed to Ted Cruz, McConnell has developed this reputation as this rational guy who comes in at the last minute and cuts a deal with Harry Reid. But really, what good is that if this deal just kicks the can down the road like every budget deal, every debt limit deal has so far, perpetuating government by crisis? Ted Cruz gets most of the attention as being a crazy obstructionist, but Ted Cruz hasn't actually done anything. He didn't hold up anything in the Senate. His filibuster was a charade approved by Harry Reid. But McConnell, the guy who's considered the moderate next to Cruz, has quietly transformed the Senate. Under his leadership of the minority, he's required nearly every piece of legislation to meet the 60-vote threshold. Filibusters under his tenure have no modern or ancient precedent. And you know what? He actually might pay the price for all of this. McConnell will have to defend his tactics to his constituents in Kentucky next year. He's up for re-election. And a new survey of voters in Kentucky shows that he's running neck and neck with Kentucky's Secretary of State, the Democrat, Ellison Lundergan Grimes. They're both at 37%. On top of that, according to that same poll, McConnell has an unfavorable rating of 52% in Kentucky, and a plurality of voters, 43%, would like to see him replaced instead of re-elected. So what this means is next year, the leader of the filibustering Republicans in the Senate will be fighting for his political life. He can't obstruct this coming election. And if he goes down and Republicans have to pick a new leader, it might be wise to remember what hyper-filibustering did to the last guy's political career. And joining me for tonight's Big Picture Politics panel are Chris Deaton, managing editor of Red Alert Politics, Mark Levine, progressive commentator and host of the Inside Scoop radio show, and Bob Parks, member of the Black Leadership Network and Project 21, and senior video producer for MRC TV. Thank you all for joining me. So you heard my rant off the top here about Mitch McConnell. Does the fact that he's in this what looks to be going to be a close election, and we're not talking about a primary, Republican primary right now, the polling showing a close election with a Democrat, does that change the way he operates in the Senate over the next year until the election? Let's start with you, Chris.
Well, I mean, I'm not entirely sure about that because I think the Senate is kind of status quo at this point. I think everybody is kind of on lockdown.
But it's been anything but status quo the last 5 years with the filibusters. I mean, we saw that chart in the way the filibuster's been used in the previous 200 years or so of the nation versus the way it's been used.
I mean, if you go back to the days of Everett Dirksen, I mean, it was kind of first brought out back then, and obviously this has been an issue in which Democrats and Republicans have gone back and forth as the Senate has changed the tide. I mean, obviously the judicial lockdown in the Senate, back when the Republicans were not in control, but the Democrats were in control. I mean, that was a very big part of it. And it obviously has carried forward.
So do things change, though, in the Senate? You don't?
No, I mean, I think what is probably going to end up happening with, McConnell here is, look, he's, like you said, he's locked into a very close election. What you have to remember about, these particular polls that are coming out right now is that they are, produced by firms that tend to have a little bit more of a partisan bent. That doesn't mean that they're necessarily categorically bad, but he's going to be locked into a tight election. He already is a fairly conservative man. I mean, you said that he is a little more to the left of Ted Cruz. Mitch McConnell has, been a pretty conservative center in the Senate. I don't think anybody would say anything otherwise.
I mean, he's up 50 to 17 or something against this Tea Party challenger that he's facing. Bevin, yeah. So he's the Tea Party isn't really playing much of a factor here, which is interesting in itself, Bob, isn't it? I mean, we're hearing about all these Tea Party challenges that are coming in. There's no Tea Party or challenger, really a legitimate one, to McConnell at this point. Does that signal that the Tea Party has lost some of its influence here, or what?
No, I don't think the Tea Party lost that much influence at all. I think if you have the IRS breathing down your neck as you did in the last election and swinging things just a little bit, that could make a bit
That
of a difference.
kind of came out of left field here. I mean, are you bringing in the whole IRS targeting conservative groups? They targeted leftist groups too, as well. I mean,
oh come on, percentage-wise, it wasn't that much. And I personally wouldn't give. I'll be a little less judicious as my colleague here. I won't give as much credence to a MoveOn.org poll that claims that this is a tight race. I think the Senate Democrats in general are going to have a hell of a time running, especially with the albatross of Obamacare around their necks. And so, I mean, that's something, and you can laugh, because that's the knee-jerk thing, whether it's either, reciting code words like obstruction. I mean, that's what politicians are supposed to do.
It's never gone to this level before.
Mark, if McConnell is in this tough, and if he loses, can we consider that a referendum on the tactics that have been used by Republicans in the Senate over the last several years?
Well, I think we can have a referendum without him losing. It's going to be tough to beat him. Let's be fair. I mean, Allison Grimes, she's the daughter of the Kentucky Democratic Party leader. She's got 37%. People don't like Mitch McConnell, but Kentucky's still a pretty red state. It's still got some old ties to the South. It's going to be hard to beat Mitch McConnell. The thing that I think that we need to realize on a national basis is that the filibusters done by the Republican Party against President Obama are greater than every president, every filibuster in all of American history combined. They are doing things they've never done before. They're saying, you know what, President, you don't have a right to appoint judges anymore. On the D.C. Circuit, for example, they said, you know what, we think the candidate you have is just fine, she's moderate, but we're not going to let her be there because we want the Republicans to control it. They are saying, we are taking away your right to appoint judges. Republicans have never done that before, and if they keep it up, the filibuster will end. Mark my words.
But have they been given cover by the lack of media attention to the filibuster?
Sure. I mean, the media
like I said, this is historic levels here, and you really aren't hearing this as a major story.
Well, I mean, first of all, you have to remember that the filibuster is a fairly insider tactic for Washington, D.C. I mean, if you actually say the word filibuster back home, it's not a very resonant word. I mean, a lot of people...
Which is why if we end it, no one will care.
Well, that's not necessarily true.
Let's move on to this next topic here. I think we've kind of beaten this. We're filibustering the rest of the topics here. The Voting Rights Act. It was delivered a blow by the Supreme Court earlier this year when Section 4 of it, which is determines the formula for which states and local governments have to get pre-clearance before they make voting law changes. The court struck that down and said Congress needs to come up with a new formula. Last time Congress reauthorized the Voting Rights Act, it wasn't controversial at all. It was 2006. It was a vote of 98-0 in the Senate, 390-33 in the House. Bob, can we assume that Republicans and Democrats are just going to come together like they did just a few years ago and fix the Voting Rights Act as the court told them to do?
I think it should go back to the states to determine, because the states know best what's going on in their states and whether there's really a need for this. I personally am insulted by all this need for voting rights changes because there's an assumption by the left that, one, blacks are too stupid or too unable to get IDs. I had a crew go out, and I'm one of the few people who had a crew go out and ask black people in this town how hard it was for them to get an ID, and they laughed at the question. And so for this whole thing is just built on.
It goes beyond race too, and we have a chart here, and it shows that voter IDs will affect minorities a lot more than it affects, your average white guy. And it also affects people who are poor. It affects lower income people.
But,
so yeah,
wait a minute.
It's socioeconomics here, but ultimately
assuming that there's a whole group of people.
It's not too stupid to get an ID. It's people who are working 2 jobs. They can't get by. They're trying to make it. Now you're telling them they need to take a day off work, so go to the DMV and sit down.
It's a poll tax. It's a clear poll tax. You can't charge someone to vote. It's against the Constitution of the United States to charge someone to vote, and that's what these states are doing. In Georgia, what they did is they said, you know what, in the white areas, it's going to be around the corner. It's going to be in your neighborhood. But we're not going to provide it in Atlanta, where the massive black population lives. When you say the states should be in charge, that sends shudders up my spine. That's Jim Crow. Oh, Alabama, they'll be fine. Mississippi, they'll be fine. We trust Georgia.
The patronizing is all well and nice. But you know something?
You don't fear Jim Crow laws in the South.
Well, Democrats should know about Jim Crow's laws better than anybody else, but I don't know if you want to open that door. But I'm just saying...
I'm opposed to Jim Crow laws
but I am saying that if a black person can find enough time to go to the supermarket or go to get lunch or to go to the bank during the week, they can find enough time to go to a DMV.
And if they're disabled and 90 years old?
Then, as black people in this area said, you find people, there are people who will help you get
So voting isn't a right. It's something you have to depend on your neighborhood to do. You got to have friends, you got to have colleagues to help you out.
I want to bring Chris in here on this issue because ultimately what happened here is that 2006 this law was reauthorized and moved up. What's changed in the last 7 years why there should be a problem here in doing this again?
Well, I think the Supreme Court happened.
But the Supreme Court, Roberts clearly says that our country has changed.
Yes,
Congress must ensure that legislation passes to speak to current conditions. He clearly is telling Congress they need to readdress this issue.
Yes, he absolutely is.
So
and I think what's changed with Congress or what's changed with the country in general? Because what's changed with the country in general is that, look, this formula was based on 1964 laws. And if you look, for instance, in the original VRA, the entire state of Mississippi was covered under the VRA. And that was largely because you had less than 50% overall voter turnout. If you look nowadays in a state like Mississippi, there are only a handful of counties where that is still the case.
We got to go to a commercial break here, so we'll pick this up in just a second here.
Years,
all right, Mark, hold on a sec. More of tonight's Big Picture Politics panel right after the break. And welcome back. Let's talk about the minimum wage now, something even Republicans support increasing. According to a new Gallup poll released earlier this week, 58% of self-declared Republicans say that they want to raise the federal minimum wage from $7.25 to $9 an hour. Republican support for raising the minimum wage is still less than that of either Democrats, who are 91% in favor, or independents, who are 76% in favor. But it's only 18 points lower than the national average of 76% people in favor of raising the minimum wage. Now, poll numbers like these have congressional Democrats and the Obama administration thinking they can reach even higher. Right now, a group of liberal lawmakers led by Iowa Senator Thom Hartmann and California Congressman George Miller are gathering support for a bill to raise the minimum wage to $10.10 an hour by 2015. The president himself has reportedly backed this proposal, and for good reason, too. If the minimum wage had actually kept up with inflation, it would be way higher than what it is now, just $7.25 an hour. In fact, the real value of the minimum wage and wages in general has declined so much in the past half century or so that even if the Harkin-Miller bill passes, the minimum wage would still be 67 cents shy of its 1968 high of $10.77 an hour. Also worth noting, raising the minimum wage is a great economic stimulus. According to a recent study by the Economic Policy Institute, increasing the national minimum wage from $7.25 to $10.10 per hour by July 1st, 2015 would result in a net increase in economic activity of approximately $32.6 billion. And over that period would generate approximately 140,000 new jobs. Even raising the minimum wage to just $9 would, according to recent Chicago Fed, increase the level of real gross domestic product, GDP, by up to 3.3 percentage points in the near term. So this sounds like a plan, right? Well, let's bring back our politics panel, Chris Deaton, Mark Levine, Bob Park. So first question to Bob and to Chris here. Of the 56% of Republicans who support raising the minimum wage, are any of them on this panel right now? Chris?
Bob?
No.
No? No. I think we're 0 for 2.
So I want to bring up this other chart here, and it shows the increase in the minimum wage by real dollars going up, and you'll see it's a steady increase here. We have the chart. There it is. So you see at the bottom the dark green line, that's the statutory dollar of the minimum wage. What you see at the top is effectively the purchasing power of the minimum wage. You see that it peaked out up there in the 1960s, and since then it's declined. Why not just have the minimum wage have the same purchasing power as it had in the 1960s, when was the golden age of the American middle class?
Well,
Chris?
if only it were that easy. I mean, first of all, you're talking about that poll talking about $9 an hour. Miller's and Harkin's bill actually has a minimum wage that would go in excess of 10. If you go back to Vincent Gray's bill, that was
still
here
lower
in Washington,
than the real
D.C.,
purchasing
that was
power
in excess
that we
of
made
$12
in the
an hour.
1960s here.
If you go back to D.C., where the bill was in excess of $12 an hour, and he vetoed it, citing concerns that it was going to drive away jobs.
Citing concerns that it was going to drive away Walmart.
No, well, it was a bill that was targeting Walmart, but that doesn't change the principle of the matter. When you talk about setting price floors like this, Economics, you create a zero-sum game out of that, where some people are inevitably going to lose out.
The billionaires who employ hundreds of thousands of people.
But what's going to end up happening, though, is that a lot of Democrats like to imagine that if you raise the minimum wage, it's going to create this altruistic sense among business owners, where all of a sudden we're just going to cut our profits. It's not going to happen. They're going to pass the cost along to consumers. They're going to pass the cost along to workers in terms of laying people off. Already
the costs, Bob, are passed along to taxpayers. If you look at Walmart, their employees are some of the biggest recipients of federal dollars, of welfare. Shouldn't we raise the minimum wage and tell Walmart that they should take responsibility of their own workers and pay them enough so that they can make ends meet rather than taxpayers having to come in and foot the bill?
Well, I guess one of the problems that I have with the whole concept is this condescending view that people who are on minimum wage are on minimum wage for life. There are certain people who earn what are called raises. They work hard. They spend a certain amount of time there. They are no longer making the minimum wage. And I'll tell you, there's only one instance where I would be for raising the minimum wage. And that would be if you raise that, whatever the difference is from what the minimum wage is now to whatever it is, and give that employee that full amount. But what happens is when you raise the minimum wage up, you also increase their taxes. Now, if you want to be for raising taxes on the poor, fine. I'm not going to do it.
I'll take that deal. I'll take that deal. We'll raise the minimum wage and we'll cap the payroll tax.
Well, you never hear that. You never hear that.
President Obama, you remember, had a lower payroll tax. Republicans wanted to increase the payroll tax, wanted to increase the taxes on the poor.
Let's steer the conversation back to what Bob was talking about here, because he really makes an excellent point talking about upward mobility. We need to talk more about upward mobility in this country. Mm-hmm. We need to stop talking about setting price floors for people earning wages. It is not an undignified thing to earn a minimum wage because we aren't having a conversation enough about new tax policies, about new job new job training policies, about workforce development policies that are going to allow people to ascend their career.
Let's get
that's fine. I'm not against that.
3/4 of people on the minimum wage are adults. They're not teenagers. A majority are the primary wage earners for their family. If you think that you can feed a family on the minimum wage, I urge you to try it. It's very, very hard to do.
No, this is a very idealistic argument.
How do you move out of poverty if you don't have a home? How do you move out of poverty if you can't afford rent? How do you move out of poverty if you can't afford food, if you can't afford health care? I mean, that's one thing that Obamacare does. Actually, it puts a lot of people on health care. You can't rise above that floor unless you've got a ladder. And if you're struggling to eat,
people who are
you don't have a ladder.
Create those ladders. Guys like Michael Bennet and Rob Hartmann, who have introduced legislation that would better align workforce development programs with the needs of the economies in which these workers and people leaving educational institutions are going. Mike Lee has a very fascinating tax policy and a new education policy. He proposed to the Heritage Foundation a couple of weeks ago. Imagine it, but you're not addressing them though. We're talking about the minimum wage here. I'm trying to drive back the conversation
about education policy,
mobility. Could you imagine somebody being accredited for going to the New York Philharmonic and getting training there? You can't do that under current education policy. These are the kinds of things that allow people to rise up beyond that floor they're at right now. And
there's a big problem with upward mobility. I mean, that's the concept of the American dream, this idea of upward mobility. But amongst developed nations, the United States is last, basically, when it comes to upward mobility.
And you know when we were good? In 1968, when the minimum wage was at its peak, income inequality was very low in America. Since then, as the minimum wage has declined, income inequality has increased.
And I want to pick up on another argument. This idea that these minimum wage jobs are stepping stones to other jobs is not really flushed out by the facts nowadays. We look at the average age of people working in these minimum wage jobs. They're not teenagers, not in their young 20s. They're upper 20s. They're people trying to support families. You have more than 3 people looking for every one available job in the economy. This is not the sort of economy where people can just leave a minimum wage or grow from there. We have to create some sort of floor that people can survive on that can fuel the economy. Right, Bob?
And if not, taxpayers have to pay for it, right?
And so if we raise the minimum wage, as it always happens, the costs will be passed down to the consumers. So there's these same people who are making...
I mean, the average Walmart worker makes $20,000. The poverty line is like $22,000 here.
But I'm still saying that the costs always get shifted.
They never get shifted. We always hear this argument, and yet corporations are sitting on billions of dollars in cash, more profits than they have ever in 50 years, and they're not spending it. This idea that, they're going to pass it on to the consumer, there's a market out there, and the consumers are going to pay what they're going to pay, and not a penny more.
And you know what else billions are sitting on? Lots of farm subsidies. This is a New York Times analysis of data collected by the Environmental Working Group. We're moving on to the next topic here. The federal government paid $11.3 million in taxpayer-funded farm subsidies from 1995 to 2012 to 50 billionaires or businesses in which they have some form of ownership. Now, this list of 50 billionaires who've received subsidies include Microsoft co-founder Paul Allen, investment titan Charles Schwab, Truett Cathy, owner of Chick-fil-A. These guys have a collected net worth of $316 billion, and they're receiving taxpayer money farm subsidies. Now, I don't want to blame Republicans. This is a bipartisan issue. Democrats and Republicans seem to be completely okay with the corporate welfare spigot flowing. I have a problem, though, with when conservatives say we need austerity, we need to go after these welfare queens, which don't really exist. Meanwhile, these billionaires are actually welfare queens, and they're completely silent. Where's the Heritage study on this? Where's the Fox News investigation on this stuff? Why the silence, Chris?
Okay, let's take a look at the draft of the first farm bill that came out of the House of Representatives. It cut 36% from farm policy over the last bill. Biggest percentage decrease in the history of farm policy in the United States of America. That bill also,
not the subsidies.
False. No, it's cutting farm policies. You can't conflate SNAP with that. It's completely.
We all agree with cutting farm subsidies, I'm sure.
In the second bill that was passed out of the House, SNAP was decoupled from the Farm Bill. That still maintains a 36% cut in farm policies. That's what we're talking about here. And we are also talking about the elimination of direct payments. If you spend some time around the Hill, there are farmers who will come to members of Congress and they'll say quietly, we're actually kind of embarrassed we're getting these direct payments. It's absurd. They want them to be cut. They understand they have to have skin in the game, too. That bill cuts direct payments completely.
And it substitutes them back in as crop insurance. Let's just end farm subsidies once and for all for, say, any farmer that makes over $100,000. Deal?
No deal.
Deal?
Bob, why don't we stretch it out? Chris is saying that we're going to do something about these billionaires receiving farm subsidies. Why don't we do something about the billionaires in the oil industry receiving tons of taxpayer subsidies, about to the tune of $40 billion every 10 years?
You know, we're right off of K Street. There are people who do nothing but come to this town to go and get on their knees and beg politicians for handouts. I mean, I'm happy that you said at the start that this was a bipartisan issue, because it is. There's clearly both sides. I mean, whether it's the Commerce Secretary and her family or Republicans, they all need to go, and unfortunately, because there's so much money, our money, that are exchanging hands in this town, you have people who will lobby. I would love to see all the subsidies go away for all business, for all industries.
Okay, so you agree. You would end farm subsidies, because I would.
I would love to see all these things go away.
The reason why the K Street is so influential is because we have a political system that depends on constant fundraising. So doesn't this come down to a problem of money in politics, Chris?
Well, I don't necessarily think so. I mean, I think a lot of this, I mean, the way that you're talking about right now, trying to eliminate these programs, kind of wholesale right off the bat, it comes down to a large problem of reform takes time.
But we had a phase out. We had a phase out that was supposed to take place over 5 or 6 years. It was supposed to be over by now. And guess what? Congress, with respect to farm subsidies, they were phasing out direct payments, and now it's coming back in. It's coming back in with crop insurance. We don't need farm subsidies for farmers making over, I'll give you $200,000 at some point. How about $1 million? Can we agree a millionaire farmer doesn't need a farm subsidy for the taxpayers?
What we need to steer the conversation back to
is that... You can't agree with me on that?
All right, 10 seconds, last word.
We need to steer the conversation back to saying that reform takes time. The House Farm Bill does make some substantial sacrifices. It's moving in the direction that I think people on both sides of the aisle understand they want to see.
We'll see what happens. We're out of time here, Bob.
Can happen right away. Look at Obamacare.
All right, we're out of time here. But I'll be shocked if billionaires see some pain from this austerity regime here. Chris Deaton, Mark Levine, Bob Parks, thanks so much.
Thanks.